Hello and welcome to Sips and Substance, where we distill politics down to its essence. I'm Justin, and we have Jonathan over here.
Hello.
And we're going to do something a little different this week. Instead of, giving our takes on the specific events that have happened during the Trump administration, we're just going to talk political strategy at a high level and then sort of weave that into some really important events that have happened this week.
We figured that if we try to cover the news, we would have to be on for 2-3 hours, and nobody needs that, especially Justin, who's trying to do the video editing. So we're going to give Justin a break and focus more on what we think about the Democrats probably ought to do, rather than try to just navigate through the entire outpouring of whatever has come from the Trump administration this week.
Now, before we do that, tell us what we're drinking. I hear you have another
Today
gold
we have
medalist.
Yes, we have a gold medalist from North Boulder, Wibby Brewing. They market it as a cold IPA, and it's kind of a funky Boulder tie-dye can, so I have a tie-dye shirt on, kind of go with it. But it is a cold IPA, but they won their gold medal in the Contemporary American Pilsner category because there's kind of a lot of overlap there. They use a lot of it's light and kind of crisp like a Pilsner, but with the hop finish of more of an IPA. It's got Citra, Mandarin, and Bavarian hops. So some of the traditional Pilsnery kind of hops, but some of the more IPA hops will give it a little bit of a citrus kick at the end. So really interesting beer. It's well deserving of the gold medal. I think it's nice. It's kind of, as I said, it's kind of crisp. It doesn't sort of overwhelm your palate. I think this beer would go well with a lot of different foods, and quite tasty.
All right. So the three major events that I want to cover this week are the OMB Memo fiasco, the mass firings of inspectors general, and then the confirmation hearings.
Yeah, and I think these will give us a good sort of pedestal, I guess, or a jumping off point to get into the strategy. So yeah, that's why we thought these issues were important enough that we pulled them out from all the other stuff and wanted to cover that.
Yeah, and we also wanted to be cognizant of the fact that we had that horrible plane crash in the DC area. We don't really want to politicize that right now, where there's still an ongoing investigation, but we will certainly be talking about how Trump has politicized it and, what Democrats could do about that. But as far as actually discussing the event itself, I don't think there's anything that really needs to be said other than it was a horrible accident.
Yep.
So this OMB memo fiasco, basically what happened was OMB released a memo that said, hey, we're going to freeze all funding and we're going to review it. We want to make sure that we're in line with Trump's executive order where we're going to get rid of all this Green New Deal stuff, DEI, basically anything that the Republican Party really looks down upon.
The Marxist DEI stuff, you might.
Yes. Now, the problem was it was a very sloppily written memo and they gave very little guidance. And so what ended up happening was you had Medicaid portals, they weren't functioning. A lot of private sector groups that rely on government loans, contracts, etc., they were in complete turmoil. So, you might say something along the lines of, well, who cares, right? Well, a lot of these private sector groups, they're providing healthcare to rural hospitals, Meals on Wheels, opioid addiction treatment. The government often uses contracts to allow the private sector to do work that government doesn't really have the expertise to do. And so a lot of these programs were put into turmoil and the backlash was severe. There was a immediate legal battle plus a preliminary injunction. And the OMB basically rescinded the memo in a couple days. And they said, the media is overreacting, but you know what? Maybe you could write a better memo next time, right?
And I think another part of this that we should mention is this pause was supposed to last like 90 days, right? And if you're in the middle of, say, construction and you have to pause for 90 days, that's a problem. If you're in the middle of, say, medical research and you have to pause for 90 days, that's a problem. If you're feeding the poor or the elderly or students or whatever, and you can't feed them for 90 days, also kind of a problem, right? And this is, as you said, this kind of cascaded throughout the government. And I think it's very important to bring up in terms of what we want to talk about this week, because it's a really good example of looks like they're going to try whatever they want to try, right? They don't really have. We talked before about, with executive orders, you can't really create law from whole cloth, as lawyers like to say. But it looks like they're willing to try, right? They want to test all their boundaries, and this is a big way of pushing back, and then this might not work. All right, no harm done. We'll take it back. So it's just a really interesting approach, and by interesting I mean very puzzling approach to how you might want to govern. By I know there's a lot of really ideologically motivated conservatives out there that think they want to starve government and then throw it in the bathtub and drown it. And this would be a way to do that by cutting off all spending. But the legality of it and the reverberations from it, I think, are something that they didn't really anticipate well enough.
Right. I mean, oftentimes we ask the question, is it malicious or is it incompetence? And I think in this case, it's both.
It's both. You win. Bingo.
All right. And the next topic I want to briefly mention are the Inspector General firings. So these are officers that look for waste, fraud, abuse, and misconduct in the government. And there's some really strict laws that basically say you have to give Congress 30 days notice if you're going to make a change. And you have to give a specific rationale, case-specific reasons for why you're doing it. So Trump didn't do that at all. He just fired 18 inspectors general. And it got to the point where even Republican Senator Grassley wrote a pretty sternly worded letter to Trump saying, hey, yeah, you can't do this. And then the group of inspectors general called the Council of Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, they effectively told the White House to pound sand. They wrote, and I quote, I recommend that you reach out to White House counsel to discuss your intended course of action. At this point, we do not believe that the actions taken are legally sufficient to dismiss presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed inspectors general. And, one of the inspectors general, Phyllis Fong, who's been there since the late 90s, she's
Justin's new crush, I think.
Outside. Yeah, justice for Phyllis. She was dragged out of her office by security.
I kind of expected to see you wearing a T-shirt today.
Yeah, right. I'm ready to take to the streets. But no, I mean, she survived the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, Obama, the first Trump administration, and Biden. So she clearly must be really good at her job. She works in the agriculture department, and you know what? There's food stamp fraud, right? It's her job to find it. And I just found it really interesting that, conservatives are always talking about, oh yeah, all those people buying lobster with their food stamps. Well, it's her job to stop those sort of things, right? SNAP fraud, EBT fraud, whatever it is.
I think the other thing we should note when we talk about the firing of the inspectors general is why people ought to care, right? Because at some level, they're firing bureaucrats from a large bureaucracy. You can easily overlook that. But these people do have a pretty important role in that they make sure that their area of government sort of plays by the rules, right? If you're in the USDA and you're the inspector general, you're making sure that the food inspectors are doing things properly. You can make sure that the people who are inspecting bridges, for example, are doing things properly, right? It's just oversight that's supposed to be by nonpartisan. And generally, they do a pretty good job. Again, Phyllis survived all kinds of administrations, all kinds of partisanship, ebbs and flows. She was still there. But Trump administration wants to get rid of anybody who might have any sort of oversight that would be like, wait a minute, you can't do that. They don't want to hear that. So here they go again, pushing the boundaries of what's permissible to them.
Right. And related to that, there's going to be a purge at the FBI. It probably already would have happened by the time you hear this. But any FBI employee that worked on the January 6th investigations or the classified document investigations, they're going to be fired. And all of Christopher Wray's promotions, well, they're going to be axed as well. They either have to retire, be fired, resign. They have some options there, right? And then a lot of the heads of the field offices are being replaced. It's 20 plus, I hear. So that's somewhat related as well.
Same kind of thing where they don't want anybody that shows any kind of independence. And I think it's important to remind everybody that Christopher Wray, right, and all of his people were appointed by Trump, right? He picked this guy. It's not like this is an Obama appointee. These are Obama people that are still hanging around. These are people he picked, but they didn't play the game and go along and sufficiently kowtow to his whims. So out they got to go.
All right. And then the last one are the confirmation hearings. So we had RFK, Tulsi Gabbard, Kash Patel, and Russell Vogt. Well, Vogt was last week, but I wanted to bring Vogt in to this discussion because he's going to be the head of OMB. And they're going to be the ones really driving this Project 2025 initiative and the Trump agenda. So he's going to be the new boogeyman for the Democrats. And, you might not have heard of him, but you probably will over the next 4 years. And, based on what I saw, I think both Kennedy and Gabbard are a little bit of peril. I would probably put their chances at 50-50 at this point. It really depends on, if they get out of committee, right?
It's a sad commentary on the state of the American government, right? Yeah. When you have one guy that what's interesting is that watching the RFK hearings a little bit and looking at the aftermath, he really suffered after a Republican went after him, right? Was it Cassidy? Mm-hmm. Cassidy, the senator from Louisiana, who is a doctor, couldn't get him to say, that any wouldn't get him to agree to any medical facts. RFK likes to come across as a guy who's, I'm pro this and that and everything. I just need to see the data. I'm pro safety. And it's like, well, the data is clear, and RFK wouldn't agree. And then I personally think he's more of a threat. But if you think Gabbard is more of a threat, there was plenty of fun stuff there for you too. She would not admit that Edward Snowden is a traitor, which is an obvious. I don't know how that is. I don't even understand that. She said, all she go back, I support the Constitution. I don't know what. And this, again, Republican questioning. So go figure what's going on with that.
Yeah. And unfortunately, both Kash Patel and Russell Vogt, they're almost certainly going to be confirmed. So, now that we've kind of equipped ourselves with these events, I think it begs the question, how should Democrats respond to all this? Republicans, they have a strategy. And I briefly want to talk about that. And it's basically, don't piss off Trump, number one, and have some sort of flexibility, independence that you can sell to your voters if you're in a swing state. That's basically it, right?
Yeah, and I even think that gives a lot of them too much credit. I mean, I think even defining them as a political party in not a cult of personality at this point is a little bit of a stretch, right? Like you said, their main goal now is not constituent service. It's not advancing the national interest. It's pleasing Donald Trump enough that he's happy with them, right? And if they can have some performative stuff around the edges to try to stay elected with their in their swing states, great. But I think they know that if they piss off Trump, they're going to be primaried. And even if you're in a swing state, I mean, Republicans have shown in the past, they'll nominate a complete nutcake, right, in order to punish somebody who's a moderate that can get elected in a swing state. They've sacrificed House and Senate seats on the altar of putting in a Trump loyalist, and I think that's probably going to be their bigger concern if you have a pending election coming up, is what's the primary going to look like.
Yeah, I mean, I understand why a lot of Democrats are upset. There's a GOP trifecta right now, but the Republicans have left a lot of money on the table, so to speak. I mean, conceivably, they could have had 58 Senate seats right now if they had, over the past few years, nominated normal people in the primary, right? But they didn't. So, on to the Democrats. What are they supposed to do?
Yeah, I think it's interesting or useful to look at, like, what are they doing now? Like, where are they? And they're not doing a whole lot publicly, right? You don't see any sort of, if you think back and compare this to the first Trump administration, right? When Trump won the first time, there were people in the streets, there were big protests, there were all kinds of movements. Democrats were fired up to resist. There were protests against the Muslim ban at airports. There were all kinds of things. We're not seeing that now, right? And a lot of that is that the base is just kind of dispirited, right? And you can see this if you read things, you can hear about what reporters are commenting on. But if especially younger people, they're like my daughter is very, very ardent Democrat, and she's really turned off by the results. Right? It makes her feel there's a lot of despair out there, and she's not alone. Right? The Democratic base is kind of at sea, and we can see this in how much they're turning off politics and not paying attention. CNN's news ratings are just through the floor. People aren't interested. They want a break at this point. And I think part of that is from sort of the Democrats kind of fading into the background and not really leading any sort of, hey, you know what, this is too much, right? There at this point, it's much more of, we'll object to a couple things like maybe RFK or Tulsi Gabbard, but business as usual will go on for the rest of things. We'll approve Marco Rubio, whatever to zero that they voted for. And I think that they're missing sort of almost a mandatory opportunity to try to get something going, to try to bring people back in line. And also, a lot of these things are worth standing up against on their own right.
Yeah. So the Democrats had an emergency meeting, and they basically said they have a three-pronged strategy. There's the legal strategy. Trump is doing unlawful things, so we're going to fight it in court. There's the legislative strategy, where they know that they have power when it comes to passing legislation due to the thin majorities in the House and the fact that they're able to filibuster in the Senate. And then the third prong is taking it to the streets, so to speak, the messaging campaign. And, I think this is where the Democrats are really hurting, is that they don't really have a message yet. I actually think that from a legal perspective, they're doing really well, right? The Democrat adjacent groups, they're looking at these executive orders. They're getting all the lawyers lined up, and they're fighting in courts. And they already have a couple injunctions that they could talk about, which is good. Yep. And I think the legislative stuff is going to happen once we start getting to the debt ceiling fight and passing a budget. But besides that, it's more of like a wait and see. But yeah, the messaging thing is, where they're just lacking. And we saw that in sort of the Hegseth confirmation hearings, where they made some good points, but it was very muddled, right? It seemed like they were playing from behind. Now, I do think that when it came to RFK, they knocked it out of the park, right? But I think that's also just, RFK is just such a horrible nominee.
I would say they knocked it out of the park-ish, because the real noticeable, right, questioning came from the Republicans. That's far more memorable and newsworthy, I think, than the Democrats opposing him, right? But again, I do think that they're working on that. But this is where I agree with you 100% that it's the messaging where they're falling short. Mm-hmm. And I think their idea of like, oh well, Cory Booker is going to be the social media czar, and he's like, no, he's not. He doesn't. If you we've linked down there the stuff that in the show notes that came out of the meeting with the Democratic governors, talking about how Cory Booker has all these great plans for social media, and it just looks like somebody. It looks like he's older than me trying to navigate social media, which is just really kind of funny. But the idea is like, I think we need to get into a lessons learned sort of episode at some point going forward. Is like, why did all this happen to begin with? But one of the lessons for me that I think that they need to apply in their messaging is they need a simple theme, right? They tried all this high-minded stuff. Threat to the Constitution, this, that, and the other. Okay, sure. But the people that were movable on the economy, right? They were movable because they thought Trump would be better for them on the economy, and maybe immigration too, right? The Democrats need a theme. And I think right now, the theme that's screaming out to me that I would pursue would be safety, right? Trump is a threat to you and your family. And don't do business as usual. Say talk about, this is an emergency. We have to react somehow. He's a threat to us. And, how would you do that? Well, this is where I would really go after him for politicizing this plane crash. It was just horrible what he did. and he's still at it. He won't stop because that's who he is. People ask him, "Oh, are you going to go to the site? What do you want me to do? Go swimming?" It's like, yeah, that's the kind of response we want from a president. But beyond that, right? Again, it's not that so much that he's been in office, 11 days, 10 days at the time of this plane crash. Nothing he did really caused this plane crash. But the stuff he's doing, right? The focus on DEI and scapegoats and Biden. And one of the first things he did was eliminate Air Travel Safety Board from the DHS. And his new transportation secretary, the first thing he did is say, I'm going to go after DEI, right? And they're still at it. He passed it. He put out an executive order after the plane crash, blaming it on DEI. So while he may not be to blame for this happening, and he clearly is not, right? He is in no way equipped to learn from it and prevent it from happening again, because all he cares about is what it means for him. And I think this would be a great way in for Democrats to start getting people to realize, hey, you know what? There's real danger that can come from a Trump administration.
Right. So I think you're definitely correct in the sense that, you can't really blame this particular event on Trump. There have been warning signs for years now with close calls in that corridor, and we didn't do anything about it. And now we're suffering the consequences.
Yeah. And for years people have been saying, hey, hire more air traffic controllers. This is a horrible job. It drains the crap out of you. One of my former family members, his father was an air traffic controller. So an ex of somebody in our family. He couldn't even retire. They kept pulling him back because they didn't have people to replace him with. Right? These are people that are overworked, and the job is horrible. It pays well, but the job, it requires like laser focus for 12 hours at a time, more or less, and doing it all the time. There's no room for error. If you and I make a mistake in our jobs, we can fix it. Right? Not that, you code something wrong. Oh, look, there's a bug. Let me fix that. Right? I grade something wrong. I say, oh, look at that. I made a mistake. I can fix your grade. You make a mistake as an air traffic controller, they're fishing people out of the Potomac. Right? And everybody's been able to say, well, you know what? We could put money here, or we could put money in my pet project. And that's what everybody's done for a long time.
Yeah. So I think, highlighting the lack of empathy and sort of like the future plan, right? So I think it's a really easy sell to say, hey, if you cut these safety precautions, this is going to happen more. So let's not do that, right? We will help you fund air traffic control hiring, right? That could be part of their legislative and messaging toolkit for the future, right? So when this debt ceiling vote comes to pass, make sure you appropriate those funds and you fight for it, right? You should be on every news station. And frankly, you need to have that message trickle down to the non-political areas, right? And say, hey, we had this disaster. We want to fix it, right? And the grim reality is that Democrats don't really have the credibility right now of being the fix-it party.
Well, right? That's exactly right. They don't have the credibility of being the fix-it party or the party that fights, right? And I think that's a large part of their image problem. Yeah. They need to be able to do both. And that's why I think if they could start adopting some sort of common theme, like, hey, Trump's unsafe, because I think you can trickle that down to a lot of these other issues, like RFK is unsafe. Your healthcare is threatened by the Trump administration. He wants to take vaccines away. He wants to stop research on infectious diseases. All the craziness that he's talking about. They want to cut Medicaid funding, right? And that doesn't apply to everybody, but that applies to a certain subset of voters who get Medicaid. Hey, you're being threatened, right? And who knows what he wants to do with Obamacare? He keeps saying he's going to have a better idea. I don't think anybody should feel perfectly safe if they're on Obamacare. If they cut federal spending, they'd be happy to cut that, right? They have talked about cutting the subsidies for that. So your healthcare is potentially threatened by Trump. Your security as a nation is definitely threatened by somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, right? We went through, and we can go over it again, but she's just not a credible, serious person to handle intelligence in the United States. And to put domestic security under the guise of somebody like Kash Patel, who's clearly in the position to hunt out Donald Trump's enemies and punish them, right? That's not going to improve security for Americans at large. And you can go down the list, right? We'll talk, I'm sure next week we will be talking about tariffs, because as of this recording, tariffs are supposed to happen tomorrow, but your job is at risk, right? Tariffs are going to be miserable for the economy if he really goes through with it. And his obsession with getting rid of anything that's ecologically conscious at all will really screw our manufacturing if we cede the entire electric car market to China and Europe, right? They're happy to jump in and do that. China is already kicking our ass at electric cars, and they will continue to do so even more if we just say, you know what, everything will be gas powered. And so I think you can talk about all kinds of ways that Trump's proposals are a threat to American life.
So I think one of these problems, though, is engagement, right? Maybe I'm just cynical, but I don't see the population responding to those types of messages until something actually happens, right? So unfortunately, the plane crash is a good example where you could say, hey, cutting air traffic safety and air traffic controllers, terrible idea. Let's not do that. But suppose RFK does get confirmed. Are we just going to have to wait for drug trials to expire, for more children to die of infectious diseases?
I'm not comfortable waiting for children to die of measles, right?
I'm not either.
I would hope that the Democratic Party would take that as a sign that says, hey, we really, really, really need to start messaging against this right now. Because if we wait and say, you know what, there's nothing we can do, they're going to confirm him if they're going to confirm him, we'll just wait and make political hay out of it when children do die. I have a problem with that. And I hope that the Democrats have a problem with that too. If they want to continue to be a party where sort of people who are a little deeper thinkers than some of the MAGA types feel comfortable, they need to get beyond that. I mean, and I do know I understand what you mean. It's like people do have a short attention span. But we talked about offline about how something like Afghanistan, right, screwed Biden. He never recovered from that. And that was a 3-year time frame. So if there's something that really catches people's attention, right, it can last and it can make a difference. I think if you start doing this now, right, it can break through.
Yeah, it's less about the particular event and more about the feeling and response to said event, right?
Yes.
You know, I don't think most people are going to point and be like, yes, it was Afghanistan that made me sour on Biden. No, it was just like that made people feel that, hey, you know what, Biden didn't come in with this amazing plan and stop the chaos. The world is still chaotic. And if the world is still chaotic, what's the fundamental difference between Trump and Biden? Trump at least helped my wallet, right?
Yeah, and I think just the last couple things I wanted to mention of other ways you could show that Trump is a threat. It's like the in day-to-day life, the funding cuts, going at everything from schools to law enforcement and public transportation. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned before, we talked about that the IGs, getting rid of IGs makes potentially everything less safe. You could talk about the environment, but if you wanted to talk about the environment, I would be decidedly moderate and practical in terms of talking about, hey, you know what? All you people in LA, he's politicizing the disaster relief. He's going to screw you people because he feels like it'll be good for him politically, right? And all these things can kind of go together and just show that across the board, if you can message it properly, you can start talking about across the board, Donald Trump is a danger to you and your family.
We also have to avoid this whole Chicken Little thing, right? Like you can't just have someone go on to, say Joe Rogan, say the earth is going to end due to global warming in 10 years.
You can't do that at all.
You just can't do that.
Really. No, you've got to keep it simple. You've got to keep it moderate, and you've got to keep it aimed at the people. I mean, if you think about elections, and especially this last election, hardcore Republicans are going to vote for Republicans. Hardcore Democrats are going to vote for Democrats, right? You've got to get those turnouts. Okay, you need to get those people out. But the people that decide the elections are sort of the mushy middle types who are generally going to vote for something simple, like their pocketbooks, inflation, maybe immigration, right? And so you got to keep it not like, oh, global warming is this threat, and panda bear or polar bears are losing their habitats, and all that stuff is base stuff that shouldn't be coming out of anybody's mouth right now. Right now, you need to focus on, hey, we need to be a viable party in the next election, right? We need to be a party that can win rather than a party that can say, hey, you know what, we stood up for all these issues. There are issues you can have an effect on if you win that you don't need to campaign on.
Yeah. And I think, should these tariffs happen, that's where the Democrats are going to have a really golden opportunity, right?
Yes.
Because you've just taken the wind out of Trump's sails for why he got so many people to switch from Democrat to Republican.
Yep. And so, yeah, it does raise the question, right? And we had a really good argument over this, I guess it would be fair to say, trying to get ready for this broadcast and what the Democrats should do, right? And there's a bunch of different options. I mean, they could obstruct everything. But I think you made some good points. If you obstruct everything all the time, people will get tired of that, right? Now, Mitch McConnell was very good at stretching that out over long. He obstructed the crap out of the Obama administration. He did have some more tools at his disposal, being in control of the Senate for a while. But do you need to obstruct everything? Probably not. Maybe you could obstruct more, but maybe you need to be a little bit more focused. I think, as you're saying right now, not a lot of stuff has happened to show that you're right. But if he keeps going down this avenue of, hey, all these horrible things are starting to happen, you need to do more about standing up to him just so you can say we're fighting. And I think even if you're not going to fight everything right now, you've got to start to be the party of we're going to fight back rather than, well, there's not much we can do, so we're going to take it for the most part. And so what I would do is I would at least do some advertising, right? Do some social media stuff, better social media stuff than Cory Booker is responsible for. But we talked out online, like, why not have an ad during the Super Bowl, right? Why not have an ad where you have the plane crash and you ask Trump if he's going to go and he says, what, do you want me to go swimming? Right? Something like that, I think, would be pretty effective and really piss him off at the same time.
Yeah. It's high risk, but also high reward, right? Because you could sort of put a stain at the start of his administration that would be really difficult to recover from.
Yeah, because that clip is just disgusting. If you haven't seen it, one of the reporters asks Trump if he's going to go down to the scene of the plane crash, and his response is, what, do you want me to go swimming? More or less. I'm not reading off the quote right now, but that's what he says. I would invite people to go look at that. And just to think that the president of the United States could say that about a disaster where 60 some Americans were killed, a half a block, almost literally like a block from his house. Like, I
mean, you could have pictures of, these people ice skating, right? They were part of the U.S. skating team. Then show the plane crash and then say, oh, it was DEI that did this, right? Again, this is really risky stuff. It could really sour people because you are, in effect, politicizing the message. But at the same time, you're pointing out that, hey, these people are human beings. And they died, and then you're the one who politicized it.
And, well, that's, again, why I think you tie this back to Trump as a threat. He's a threat because he couldn't give a rat's ass about anybody but himself and his family. That's it. And this is a really good example of that. These people are literally, what, a mile from the White House?
Yeah.
Maybe? I mean, it's not far. I lived there a long time. Not a long time, but a few years. I know more or less where things are in D.C. The Potomac River is not far from the White House. He could get there pretty quickly, pretty easily, but couldn't be bothered. So definitely they need to do something, right? But along with it, it can't just be Trump's horrible. He's this miserable guy. You need to combine that with serious policy proposals. So in that regard, I do think you're probably right that they need to step back a little and not attack everything all times right now. Because everything you attack, you need to have this is what we do instead. If you can do that, then you might be able to start getting people to think, oh, the Democrats have some ideas. Because clearly, the last election, not enough people thought Democrats had ideas.
Right. They just seemed like an opposition party.
Yep.
They didn't stand for much. I do think that there's also some pressure points that you can do, right? So the next election, 2026, if you ignore the special elections, you have Tom Tillis in North Carolina and Susan Collins in Maine. They're vulnerable in the Senate. In the House, you have about 15 seats where Republicans won by 5 points or less. So those are vulnerable seats. You have special elections in Florida and Ohio, so they're not going to get a strong incumbency boost. And you have retiring candidates like Grassley and McConnell. And, I'm not saying that the Democrats are going to win Kentucky with Andy Beshear. But at the same time, I do think, in the right environment, those people's jobs could be on the line. Look at 2018. You had someone win in Alabama due to the Republicans fielding a horrible, horrible candidate.
Yeah, and that's probably the Democrats' best hope for like Kentucky and Iowa and Grassley's Iowa, right?
Yes.
So I would not put it past Republicans for nominating complete whack jobs in either of those states where the loyalty to Trump is the most important thing, and they come up with somebody who's completely out of right field, we'll say, not left field. And yeah, they should definitely be pushing this kind of stuff. And that's why, again, I think, as you say, we got 2026 coming up, but primaries happen before that. It's not that far. And you've got to at least give people the idea that you're going to fight for them, right? You're not going to stand back and say, well, you know what? We lost. He can do whatever he wants. Because he didn't win by that much. Almost half the population voted for the other guy, right? And if you think about third-party candidates in that, over half the population voted for someone else, right? So to be the party that kind of doesn't strike back puts you at a real disadvantage. You've got to, as you say, you have to be a bit strategic with it. But unfortunately, there are plenty of opportunities to show where Trump is letting down the American people for his own benefit, right? Especially because he's really hitched his wagon, let's keep going with the cliches today, to the very, very far right Project 2025 folks. And he's basically turned them loose. And they're doing whatever craziness they want to do and seeing what sticks. Democrats need to do something more than they're doing, right? Last week, the big thing that I saw on the news people were showing and then making fun of is that the big Democratic pushback was Chuck Schumer reading a speech very poorly on the Senate floor in a very decided monotone. And I don't even know what the point of that was. And it's like, yeah, that's not doing anything to convince people that Democrats have a reasonable response.
And he said we're aroused. He's never seen such arousal.
At about this tone.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop. The Democrats, as we said before, they have that three-pronged strategy. The legislative and legal ones are basically damage control. They're going to try and do what they can to obstruct Trump's agenda and maybe get some concessions out of him. But when it comes to messaging, that's where you're going to get the votes for the future. The messaging is key to the future.
Yep. Yeah, because as we talked about too offline, is like with people being dispirited right now, there is some subset that is not going to be coming back very easily. You've got to start reaching out to these folks who are really disenchanted Democrats right now and give them a reason to want to come back, right? And messaging is a way to do that.
Well, just remember, like, subscribe, tell your friends, and we will see you guys next week.